Skip to this timestamp to get to the recipe.
Okay, so background. I've been cooking for several years now, but the one thing that always eluded me was a good cup of tea. I grew up in a Sri Lankan household, right? And every morning and every evening my mom would make tea for all of us, and it just became something I took for granted. But one thing that stuck with me was the taste of the tea she made. It was so consistently on point, and it sort of became this standard that I hold. And every time I sip a cup of milk tea, I mentally compare myself to this taste that I remember. But over time, because of circumstances, tea became something I kind of took for granted and eventually just fell out of love with. Fast forward to 2020, the middle of lockdown, right? I have nothing else to do all day since I'm just stuck inside. Every evening, my dad would come home from work and he'd brew a batch of tea for all of us. So I'd just sit there for half an hour at the kitchen table with him and just really take in the taste of the tea. And it became a way to spend some quality time with him. And before I realized, I'd start to notice these subtle changes in the taste of the tea every day depending on how he'd make it, and that was something I started to pick up on. And as a result of this positive association that I had spending quality time with my dad, tea became this thing that I sort of fell in love with again. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to do some research, and I'm going to learn how to make a proper cup of tea, and that's what I did. A lot of the recipes I found tell me to use some ratio of milk to water, typically a 1-to-1 ratio. I found the texture of this to be a little bit off, a little bit too watery to my taste, so I experimented, and I started increasing the milk content more and more until I eventually just hit 100% milk, just an entirely milk base. But what this does is when you boil the milk on the stove, it reduces ever so slightly, and it gives you this luxurious texture that just coats the surface of your tongue. And that was something I enjoy. So that was one of the outcomes of my experiments. Number 2 was temperature. A lot of the chai recipes that I found specifically, like if you look up chai recipe, they tell you to boil the tea powder in the milk. And what I found was this really brings out a lot of those tannins and those really bitter components in the tea. And I found this really unpleasant. So from there, I decided to apply a more traditional method of brewing black tea, which is to heat the milk up to just below boiling and then steep the tea in that mixture for no less than 5 minutes. So through repeated experiments, I found a sweet spot of 70 degrees Celsius. Any hotter than that, and I noticed those really bitter components would start to come through. Any lower than that, and I noticed the tea just wouldn't brew strong enough. It just wouldn't be intense enough. And lastly, I want to talk about the amount of tea you use. Depending on how fine your tea is, like if it's like a really fine tea dust or if it's like a really big loose leaf, you don't necessarily want to measure by volume, like by teaspoons. And I'll show you what I mean by this right now.
So I've got a scale over here with a bowl on it that I've zeroed out. And to this, I'm going to add this Ceylon tea that I've been using recently. I'm going to add 3 teaspoons, which is exactly what I use in 1 cup. So that's the first teaspoon, comes up to 3 grams. Second one brings the whole thing up to 6. Third one brings it up to 9. Compare that to this Darjeeling that I picked up at a specialty store. The leaves are all large and uneven. So the first spoon comes up to 2 grams, but watch this, the second one comes up to 5. And the third one brings it up to 7, and then the fourth one brings it up to 9. So already 4 teaspoons compared to 3, and that too with that much of a discrepancy between each teaspoon. This should be fairly intuitive. Not all teas are created equal.
So to recap, there's 3 things you want to keep in mind. Number 1, use all milk for that thick, luxurious mouth-coating feel. Number 2, temperature. No higher or lower than 70 degrees Celsius. Number 3, the amount of tea you use. Although this last one will vary depending on your preference, and I recommend you experiment with the tea you have to see what intensity works for you. With all that said, let's get into the final recipe.
To make 1 serving, you'll need 1 standard US cup of milk, 250 mils. To this, you could add another 20 to 30 mils of water if you want, though it won't feel as rich. I'm pouring this all into my aluminium jug, which I'll be using to heat this up. Then I'll take all of this to the stove. I put the heat on high, and this is where I add my sugar. I typically do 2 to 3 teaspoons, depending on the bitterness of the tea that I use. So that's 2. And that's 3. Now I'm bringing in the probe of my thermometer, which I'm just going to use to stir things up quickly. Then I'm going to use it to wait until we hit 70 degrees Celsius. Almost. There. Alright, now I turn the heat off, and I'll use a kitchen towel to hold onto the handle so I don't burn myself, and then I'll bring this back to the sink. Eventually you start to pick up on when the teas reach the temperature you want without using the thermometer. If I feel like I've overshot, I give things a stir just like this to let some of the heat escape out as steam. And now I add my tea. Because of the high fat content in this recipe, you typically want to use at least 2 teaspoons to let the flavor really cut through. Here I'm using 3. I give it all a stir to make sure it's incorporated properly, and then I let it sit for no less than 5 minutes. While that's brewing, I'll fill my kettle up with a bit of water, bring that to a boil, and then pour it into my mug. This will make sure the mug stays warm and stops the tea from cooling down as fast. Once those 5 minutes are up, I give the tea one last stir to make sure it's all even. Then I pour out the hot water from my cup, and I bring in my strainer. You can see me taking it a little slow here because the mouth of my mug is a bit narrow. Make sure to squish out as much of the liquid from the leaves as you can. Leave none of that flavor wasted if you can help it. You can see there's some loose tea still left in the jug. I'm just scooping that out here and I'm doing the same to that. I typically do a second strain because if the tea is like a little too fine, then some of the smaller particles get through the mesh. You can see that happening over here. And that's basically it. Give it a nice, slow, tall pour into your mug and look at that. That soft foam at the top is what you want. And that's it. This is my perfect cup of tea.